Hello, assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Welcome to another episode of the Healthy Mind Chat with myself, Hasan Ali Khan, your host. In this podcast, this is where health and communication intersect. We speak about health and healthcare and everything around it. And our aim is to have create or inspire healthier minds, one chat at a time. And today I'm quite excited to have our conversation because I'm going to be speaking about something which is close to me. As you may have understood from my previous episodes, that I'm a medical student and I aspire to be a pediatrician. And recently, about 2 months ago, I was doing my pediatric rotation, and I came across a very interesting experience. Um, I saw many children, as you would in a pediatric rotation, and uh, and they were going through an interesting experience in that parents and themselves were complaining of what it was to live through COVID-19, especially dealing with school. And now school for majority of these children was online using technology, predominantly Zoom. And although and I would be particularly asking these kids, how does it feel? And a lot of them would give answers which were, it's not fun, it's difficult, I'm not enjoying it. Um, but I think there was a slightly more concerning thing with these patients of mine, is that I was noticing that their behaviors were changing. They weren't able to eat well. They weren't sleeping well. And then I asked them about how many hours of technology use did they have, or mainly screen time that they have. And the way I understood it was that they were spending about 6 to 8 hours, and especially if they're older kids, 6 hours at least in school using Zoom, and then they'd continue to use their laptops for homework, and then they would continue to have, now because all the extracurricular activities were now online, they would now spending time doing that. And then every other entertainment element for them, there's their Netflix, their watching whatever they want to, playing games, was now either on the laptop or they moved to TVs. And then they also had phones, and a lot of the parents were complaining about using phones. Their kids won't go to sleep and they're going all the way to the 8 hours using them. And parents were also complaining that they were finding it very difficult. And the way I understood it is that they lost their surrogate parent because there was no school. And really, parents were struggling with not knowing what to do. So, this was a question I had, and something I wanted to explore. And I am so excited to have an expert in joining us today to have this conversation and telling us more about this. And her name is Dr. Alexis Lauricella. She is an associate professor. I'm going to remove the pin so we can have you all on the screen there, Dr. Lauricella. She's an associate professor at the Erickson Institute here in Chicago, Illinois, and she's a director of the Technology in Early Childhood Center at the Erickson Institute. Dr. Lauricella earned her PhD in developmental psychology and her master's in public policy from Georgetown University, and completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University. That makes her a wildcat. Hello. Uh, her research focuses on children, learning from media, technology, and parents, teachers' attitudes towards and use of technology with young children. Dr. Lauricella cares deeply about connecting with parents, teachers, policymakers, and media producers to help connect her research to practice. She regularly provides workshops for parents and professional development for educators to help them make informed decisions about the use of technology with children. She recently published a paper which was related to, this was in the Journal of Applied Development Psychology, Journal of Children and Media Psychology, Journal of Early Adolescence, Journal of Infant Behavior and Development, New Media and Society, Computers in Education, Public Health, and multiple other reports. She is a mother. So she probably first-hand experienced what it was like during the pandemic. She also, very interestingly, did her internship at Sesame Street and has consulted them regularly. She was also my professor at Northwestern University in my degree program in health communications, teaching me health in media. Dr. Lauricella, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of this.
Oh, I'm so excited to have this conversation. Hopefully this is the beginning of a series of conversations about children, health, and especially what's happened through this pandemic. So I actually wanted to start off with a reflection for someone who is an expert in this, and you've probably going through firsthand with your children through this pandemic. How has the past year or so have been for you, and what did you kind of gather from all of this?
Absolutely. So it's an interesting space to
Mhm.
be both a parent during a pandemic, and to be researching children's media during a pandemic. So I've been getting a lot of questions from both sides. I've been trying to keep moving hats and processing this in different ways. From the parent side, and it's hard for me to even take my researcher hat during the parent side now, take it off, but it's been I think it's been interesting. I am a developmental psychologist, so I come at this from a different perspective, that I think parents play a really big role in kind of the house feelings around change.
Mhm.
And so I've been very conscious about seeing this as an opportunity, both from the research side and from the real life side. And I've been trying to kind of have that framework with my kids, because this is how I felt about television years ago. It's not going anywhere. The
Mm.
pandemic's not going anywhere. I can't just snap my fingers and have school go back to normal. And so let's take it for what it is, and let's move forward with what our daily life is like now. And that's been easier and harder depending on the day and depending on which child I'm helping with all of this. But I've really kind of tried to help look for the positives, and look for the places where this is kind of awesome and kind of fun and different in a new way. And so, there's been struggles. I have 4 kids, and they have all been at home at different points.
Right.
I have a high schooler, a middle schooler, a kindergartner, and a preschooler. And so I've seen developmentally how this has impacted different groups of kids.
Mhm.
I've seen individual differences within my house on how this is impacting different kids. And so it's been really eye-opening. As a working parent, I also will say, I've seen and know so much more about my kids' education than I did a year ago.
Right.
And that's been really nice. It's been really nice to be able to, partially through the technology, pop into their Google Classroom accounts, pop onto their Seesaw accounts, and say, instead of the dinner time conversation of saying, "What'd you do today at school?" and getting nothing, I didn't do anything at school. That's not the question. The question is, "Oh, I saw you post this picture of a unicorn. Tell me about that. I saw that you did this in social studies. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?" And it's really started some really good conversations about the realities of what they're really working on in school. And so that's been nice. To the other side of that, I joke that if anybody had told me that I would then have to spend 24 hours a day, with my kids and teach them and do my work job and, all these other things, I don't know that we would have had 4 kids. I think this is a lot. And so there's a lot of role switching. The idea that I have to be both telling them to make their bed and do their social studies lesson is a hard role. And it's an expectation and a context switch that both the parents and the kids aren't used to. Their social studies teacher used to yell at them to do the work. It didn't have to be me for everything,
Right.
or their parents for everything. And I think that's where parents are really struggling, is that we are now constantly having to say, "Please do this, please do this, please do this," outside of a space that they've been trained is not what we've been telling them to do, right? So for the last, my high schooler, I've never had to say, "Sit down and do your class in the middle of a Tuesday in the afternoon."
Mhm.
So we are relearning our roles, and that has caused conflict and shifts in, experience, I think, for everybody.
Right. Thank you for that. And I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of the conversations to come. Let me start off with this, and I think it's more on the technical side of things. How have you seen technology being used in comparison to, say, what was pre-pandemic, I guess, and what have been the changes, and maybe in terms of use, the types of technology, and the dependency of it?
So it's a big question, and it depends on age group, it depends on district and all those types of things. But generally speaking, pre-pandemic, there was still sort of a stigma around technology use for education, especially in the younger ages. There was sort of pushback with parents and families when school districts bought one-to-one technology, where they gave out Chromebooks and those types of things. There was concern from parents that kids would access inappropriate content on those devices, that they would be not paying attention, and that teachers would be slacking off and plugging them in and not teaching, right? That was sort of the common argument or concern about education and technology. Interestingly, obviously 2020 changed everything, and people had to adjust. People have still, the term screen time, you've mentioned it, pediatricians still mention it. Parents are really caught on that number, that time. And that's something that's shifted with this change, is that yes, kids are on screens for more time than they were a year and a half ago. But we're seeing some differences kind of in the beginning of the research that's coming out with districts who had already adopted one-to-one technology, frankly, having a little bit of a leg up in this transition to remote learning. One, the kids knew how to use it. They knew what the expectations were. They knew the rules around it. The teachers knew how to use it. So that fear factor, which we saw happen for a lot of teachers when suddenly, these 65-year-old teachers were told to learn how to teach kindergartners on Zoom, that caused a lot of anxiety for those non-tech teachers. So we saw a pretty big divide between those who had practiced this in some fashion beforehand and those who were getting dropped all of this at the last minute second. And I think that's important to think about, because I don't think time is the variable. I think we need to stop talking about screen time and talk about content, because yes, kids are now doing school for 6 hours potentially on a screen, but what they're doing is fundamentally different than 6 hours of a violent video game, or 6 hours of watching Netflix, or 6 hours of watching Daniel Tiger, right? Whatever we're kind of talking about. Right. And so I really do want to start, and this is something we've been arguing as media researchers for years, is like, time's somewhat important, but let's get a little bit more specific, right? I often make the analogy to food. It's not how much food you eat that matters, it's the quality and the content, right? I can't eat 16 ice cream sundaes, because that's gonna have a very different impact than if I eat 16 different fruits and vegetables over the period of a day, right? Right. And that's sort of the analogy with media, is that it really depends what the kids are doing and how they're using it, as opposed to that screen time component.
Right. And this is on the basis that as in, I remember being in class with you, and one of the things that you presented to us was that the American Pediatric Association,
American Academy of Pediatrics, yep.
Yes, their policies on screen time, which was less than 2 hours a week, something like that.
Less than 2 hours a day for young children, yep, initially. And they came out in the beginning of the pandemic and said, this isn't what we were talking about, right? Like, we weren't under the assumption that kids wouldn't be in school. And so they were pretty clear that 2 hour rule was, I wouldn't put the words in their mouths, out the window, but that let's not worry about that specifically in this context.
Right. And so so instead of now focusing away from times and screen time, what you're now saying is about content. And now they are doing a lot of their school work on online. And so since the pandemic, would you say content viewing and content usage has changed drastically, or is it the same?
So I think we have to, it's a pandemic. So a lot of
Yes.
things have changed. It's not just that school went to remote, which is something
Right.
everybody is talking about. Life went to remote. And that's really important to think about, especially when we're talking about like the middle school and high school kids.
Right.
Their social worlds got cut off pretty considerably. And so screen time, from what we're seeing, has adjusted to fill that gap, right? So I don't get to go and have coffee with you or have this conversation with you in real life because of the pandemic. Therefore, we're using Zoom. Kids didn't get to go to soccer practice. And so either they're doing a soccer lesson on their Zoom, or, their best friend from soccer, they're then doing a FaceTime to chat with them and to talk with them. So screen time has changed because the world has really changed. And we've limited all these other spaces. When you're talking about the adolescents themselves, we'd already seen their behaviors begin to change before this. We saw drinking going down, drug use going down, sexual activity going down. And we're seeing this sort of speculation that it was because instead of going out for a Friday night party, they were hanging out on their phones, doing games, chatting that way, and being able to chat with multiple people at the same time instead of picking one group of friends to party with or to hang out with. So we'd already seen adolescent behavior begin to shift away from in-person interactions and using this phone as more of a social connection. And one of the research questions I have is, okay, for those kids who had already made that transition pre-COVID to using their phone as a real tool to connect with their friends, did this social interruption of the pandemic really not impact them as much as my generation, right? Like I've never Zoomed my friends or FaceTimed my friends until the pandemic. And then we were doing Zoom happy hours and we were doing all these things. Did that group kind of have a protective experience beforehand because they were used to socially engaging in that way more than other generations? So for sure, things have changed. I don't know whether we're ever going to be able to figure out if it was for the better or for the worse, or if it was just to adjust to the world that changed underneath them.
Right. That's very interesting. I think every parent now listening to this will be like, I didn't think about the good aspects of this. and how staying at home has added this protective layer to the children. Some of the things that, the social elements that usually get spoken about in terms of being out there with an interaction in the open. Okay. As part of this conversation, I think a side conversation I did want to touch on was something that's probably, I know we discussed in class, was health messages to children. Prior to this, I was actually kind of doing my research. I know Sesame Street did a great job, I think, to a certain extent, in speaking about COVID and talking about COVID-19 and I think vaccines. I know they linked them with CNN and doing town hall meetings and whatnot. What trends have you seen from a health messages point of view to children, and how have they been received?
So that's a great question. This is very consistent with Sesame's mission and motives, and they've always kind of been on the front end of change in a variety of ways and responding to change. Their relationship with CNN was new, actually, even for them. And I think it was a really good approach because it came across as being a kid's thing, but it really wasn't. If you actually watch it with kids, they don't really want to watch the CNN town hall because it's still too grown-up-y. Like the characters pop in, which is lovely, but it was really health communication for parents secretly, right? Like they didn't frame it that way. They didn't say, we're going to teach you parents how to say this stuff in a developmentally appropriate way. But the impact really was to help parents continue to have these conversations and to support them with these conversations, and to help kids kind of process and deal with all of this. So I love the Sesame stuff. And I think it's a great way to kind of build those parent-child interactions, which is really critical. I know a lot of other kids programs have done similar things. Daniel Tiger did an episode about kind of in response to COVID, but not explicitly calling it COVID or talking about it, but how we need to all help each other and we need to stay safe for each other and we should ask questions if things are difficult. There was definitely a lot of that. What doesn't get as much press, I think, are the kind of homemade examples that really were blooming through preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers, and the creation and use of technology for communicating specific health messages to get kids ready to either come back to school. We saw a lot of school districts or childcare centers doing, having all the staff come in with their masks on and do a video and introduce themselves. And then they sent it to the families so that the kids could get used to seeing Miss Lauricella with a mask on, because that's not what they had seen beforehand. Or kind of doing a walkthrough of the new protocols when you come back into the building, how we're going to take your temperature, and then we're going to ask you some questions. And then, mom's going to leave you at the door because we need to be careful and walk you in. Like these kind of social and emotional changes that have happened as a result of it. We've seen some really impressive and not high quality development, but really effective use of technology to communicate and support families in all of these different aspects of the pandemic and all the changes that kids have had to kind of endure throughout the pandemic.
I'm curious to know from as in America is vast. It's as in I had some experience living in the UK, and a lot of things are centralized because it's government funded when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare. Here in America, things are slightly different, to say the least. So was there a difference? Did not having a central policy or central action from, say, state government or from a federal government about education? It seems a lot of work for just one school and the bunch of teachers and the staff involved. And then I know from the healthcare point of view, from the hospital's point of view, I know every institution was doing their own little thing. And in a way it was nice, but at the same time, it was this haphazard kind of approach and this chaos, which didn't help at a time where everyone was affected by the same thing. And we needed that coordinated effort. Is that kind of the same thing that was happening in the education sector? And what was the experiences like from the back end?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a universal problem in the US, is that everybody's expected to create their own messaging. And I think added to that is, in the US, at least, there was this political component of it, of whether mask wearing was a political message, whether closing schools was a political component. I mean, there's that whole other dynamic that added into this. I don't think we know yet, but I assume that we're going to see gross inequities, right? Between districts and schools who had the manpower, who, like I said, who had the technology ahead of time, who had the ability to kind of reach and connect with families to support them in this time, versus those who didn't. And we're already beginning to see that. Rural communities can't get internet access. And this, even when I was working with some librarians in Maryland, and they were talking about, like, we're bringing the remote internet to these homes, but they're so far from the towers that it's not working effectively. And so those kids are getting dropped every time they're on a Zoom call, if they're even able to get on. And so I think the inequities across technology access, across manpower, bandwidth, financial resources, all is going to play a role. And the districts and the schools who had the energy and the manpower to make videos are going to be fundamentally different than the districts who couldn't do that, in a whole host of different ways. And I think that is a problem. And I think, this is a problem with education in general. We consistently make teachers figure this all out individually even. And we saw that too with this, is that you had some teachers who were like, okay, let's do this, I'm ready to figure out Zoom. And you had other teachers who were like, I can't add one more thing to my plate. I will do the prescribed thing I have to do, but I can't really go above and beyond that. And we're going to see the ramifications of that in the future for sure. Just sort of fuller, more divergent between the haves and the have-nots, and the quality experiences versus the lack of quality experiences.
Right. So, Dr. Hasan, where are we now? So in terms of consequences, lessons learned, as in what what can we really take back? As in, obviously, the world's not changing. I know what you mentioned right before this interview is that your children have gone back to school. Some of them have,
Some.
and yes, and what would adjustment look like to a new normal? Is technology here to stay? Is it, or is it going to change? Are we going to go back to some of what we had before? What are we looking at in terms of now and then the upcoming future?
I mean, I think there's the reality and there's the what I want to have happen. I think in terms of education, we've seen very little change in education in the last 100 years. The approach, the dynamic, even with some schools incorporating technology, they're still oftentimes pulling it in a way that fits the standard structure of education. And not in very novel and creative ways. We are still very much, and we've heard this year, very much focused on test scores and performance. If you know, everybody has asked me about academic learning loss.
To that point, I had my supervisor said very pessimistically, he's a pediatrician. He's like, you can pretty much write this year off. I thought that was a very sad comment to make.
Yeah, it is a sad comment. And I think the sadder comment is, from my perspective, especially in early childhood, is the social emotional stuff. You can't write off a year of social emotional stuff. Like, you can write of social emotional learning, right? You could in theory just say, okay, learn your ABCs next year. You can say, learn algebra next year. What do we do about the social emotional loss that has happened? And not necessarily loss, but shift, right? So, right. And that's where I think we really do need to be careful for the future, is that we're spending time not so much focused on, okay, you're five levels below in math or in Spanish learning or whatever the variables are, but what kind of social and emotional loss has happened or development have we not supported this last year that's going to then make continuing to learn even harder, right? So this like additive effect on both learning and social emotional. How do we get kids prepared to come back to school? And I think, the media messages we saw were great to help kids emotionally deal with COVID. Okay, the struggle of wearing a mask. Why do we have to do it? Am I safe to wave to a friend? How close can I get? Can I play on the playground after somebody else has? Those kind of very basic kind of health message questions to get kids comfortable with being careful during COVID. I hope that we see the counter messages in a little bit of like, okay, you can hug your teacher if you're sad. You can, and whatever, and of course, within the health constraints of what happens, but I think we're going to have to bring back those lessons learned, that, it's okay to say hi to a friend within 3 feet of them in this next round. And so I hope that's a shift. I hope we take away where the technology has helped in learning specifically and in social emotional instances, and we apply that in the physical classroom. Not to say that we should be sitting in Zoom in our classroom necessarily, but examples, I think the opportunity to communicate with families more through technology is a really important outcome. I think being more flexible with how kids represent their learning should be an outcome that we see. If a kid wants to do a podcast or a YouTube video, is that an appropriate assessment compared to writing a one-page paper or direct feedback? Are we going to then, one of the things I've seen in my kindergartner's use of remote learning is her using the audio feature, the audio record feature. She can't write yet, but she can answer a lot of really hard questions verbally, right? And the teacher could use that as assessments, right? So did she understand the story? Did she understand the science lesson? She can audio record that and give it back to her. And in a class of 25 kids, that might be a solution even in the physical classroom. Okay, we're going to do the science lesson. Now each of you use your record button and tell me what you learned. You get all answers in at one shot. You don't have Mr. Know-it-all kid raising their hand and spilling it for everybody else. So I hope we see some of those creative uses of technology in the future, and ways where we're really expanding learning beyond like very specific curriculum, right? So the idea of bring your iPad on vacation and create a video submission of something that you learned at the beach, or whatever the examples are, where we're taking the learning that we want kids to be doing outside of just the four walls of their physical classroom in the future. But fingers crossed, we'll see if it actually happens.
I think COVID, as difficult as it has been, especially with as you said, the social and emotional losses for a lot of children, they also faced the loss of loved ones as well, and that's a different sort of element that has added to all of this. But I think at the same time, it has been that global break for actually us to take a step back and view what we are doing. As in, for someone who has been in higher education since so long, and just being as a student, I started university in 2006. I'm still in university in 2021. So I obviously have had a big think about education, and as you said, is the way we educate really helping us to get to where we want? And is it just about test scores? My dad, at the age of 60, whatever, is now gone back to, since he's retired, he didn't have he's an accountant without a CPA, the licensing, and he's like, who in their real life has to do a calculation in 2 minutes? I can take all the time in the world. And I was like, I hope you knew this 10 years ago, since I've been in school and had the same conversation with yourself. So it's that realization of what education is and what it actually means. And it's as I've actually dabbled with this idea of homeschooling, which kind of obviously is come into everyone's life in certain ways, and the importance of that, and how actually that could be beneficial, because you can kind of mold education for children in a certain way that kind of, from everything I've experienced, for example, push my, or at least have, say, when I do have children, set up an education system for them which is wholesome. It's understands how the world works and gives them all the life lessons in a way which is appropriate to them at the right time, and not at the age of 21 that I was at, suddenly finding myself away from home and just learning how to do the laundry for the first time. I think in this whole way, the pandemic has been really, really good in terms of reflection. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to those exact points, in the US, we have been so focused on education and performance and academic performance that we don't ever educate on these real world skills. And we know this in a variety of different contexts, that kids bring very important lessons from their home life and their home culture that they could bring into the classroom if we had like a little bit more of an opening for them to do that. And I think about things like what does it take to do the laundry? What does it take to wash the dishes? This year, especially for families with multiple kids, we are seeing older children take on a lot more of the childcare responsibility and even the education responsibility. So my husband's a 7th grade teacher, and he oftentimes on his Zooms will be teaching his 7th grade students who are sitting here, and next to them is their 2nd grade sibling who they're helping simultaneously while they're trying to do their learning. Right. And so there's those balance, time management, multitasking, right? All of these skills that are critical for learning are really being supported for some kids during this pandemic that we are not assessing. We're not, time management. My goodness, my kindergartner has bells that go off 3 minutes before her Zooms, and she knows to run from the playroom to get on her Zoom. Like, there's no way she would have done that in the physical classroom. Right. And so how do we begin to recognize that learning is broader than a 1600 on the SATs or these different assessment variables? And how do we encourage that? How do we encourage parents to keep that learning going, and for that to be kind of going back and forth from a school context to a home context where both the teacher and the kid and the family are all kind of continuing to grow and learn and explore? I think that's huge. And I hope teachers have the flexibility to do that, right? To say, okay, you know what, we're going to pause on number sentences this week, and we're going to talk about you know, this game that Emery played that has counting in it and strategy and those types of things. Like, let's bring that stuff in. So there's more flexibility in how we learn and what we're learning and why we're learning. We're not learning just to check off the box. We're learning because it's interesting and it's fun and it's cool. I mean, I think another great show that I'm obsessed with and my kids are obsessed with is Wild Kratts. And it's a TV show on PBS and it's all about animals. And to your point about homeschooling, I don't know anything about these animals. That's not my expertise, but every day my kid comes in and says, did you know this lizard lives in this place and has this many, you know, that weighs this much? And she's excited about that. She begs to learn more about that. And we need to create spaces where learning is more like that, more fun and engaging and self-directed and those types of things.
Often I've thought about this. They don't give out certificates for kindness and those subtle ways of how someone just matured, or that great answer that they give. Or that deep thinking that they showed. They're not, and the values element that we as adults often are now struggling sometimes to think about, to deal with. And when a child does expresses all of that, it shows that there are no certificates for that. There's no point system for those. I wanted to speak about, as in you're currently doing a study on learning Zoom and adolescence and technology and the protective mechanisms, some of which we've already talked about. Please tell us more what you're doing about this great stuff.
So I sort of have two different things going at the same time. One is a direct experimental research design question to understand how and if kids learn from Zoom, which I hope the answer is they learn something, and I'm pretty confident that is what we're going to find. But what we're looking at specifically is eye gaze and where people are looking while they're on a Zoom. And so what we're doing is a study with preschoolers and kindergartners, and we are reading them a kid's book. A teacher is going to read them the kid's book, and then we are tracking their eye gaze. Are they looking at the book? Are they looking at themselves? Are they looking at their peers who are wiggling around? And how does that relate to comprehension? And interestingly, I think what's particularly interesting is that adults, adolescents, and even little kids report that they oftentimes are looking at themselves in their Zoom conversations. I know I have been doing it myself. And so how do we deal with that? How do we, like, that's weird. Never, in no other interaction do you look at yourself while you're teaching, while you're talking, while you're presenting, while you're doing anything. And it's pretty distracting. And so for little kids who don't even have the kind of self-awareness to recognize that they're even really doing it, we're interested to see if that feature is problematic for learning. And so one of the conditions we're going to have is there's an option on Zoom where you can hide yourself. So other people can see you, but you're not looking at yourself talking and doing all these things. And we're going to see if that supports comprehension. So just getting your distracting self out of the way, help you focus on the book and learning. And that's something we anecdotally are also hearing in middle and high school students cases that they're turning their video off. And it's a struggle for educators to get middle school and high school students to turn their videos on. And why is that? We know adolescence is a prime period for developing your identity, and also very high insecurities during those times as you're figuring that out. So what does it do to your self-confidence if you have to look at yourself for 6 hours a day for a year and during your remote learning context? Does that have any kind of implications? So related to that, we're doing a big survey on adolescents, and to the point I made kind of earlier about, we're also focused on the negative. We're focused on how this year was fundamentally different and it messed everything up. But we're hearing that there are spaces where this has been very positive. In terms of bullying, kids who had a rough time socially in school, this has been great. Kids who are high academic achievers during school, but weren't being challenged, there's been a lot of opportunity with Zoom for them to work at their own pace and then be done at a certain period or a certain time once they've completed the assignments. And to the point I made earlier, that we know kids have already been using devices as such a tool to connect socially. And so what we're really looking at is some of these individual differences, and how do some kids, who's benefiting, how are they benefiting, how is technology being used as a kind of a mechanism or a tool to support or fill a gap in their social experiences, and then what happens when we go back to school in the fall or next year. There's this ideal that everything's going to be better and everything's going to be perfect. But for some of these students, that may not be the case. There might be a huge level of social anxiety going back. There might be concerns about bullying. There might be just an overwhelmingness of having to talk to people for 6 hours a day. And so we're really trying to look at longitudinally how this plays out. Do kids kind of flip these tools? Does, once your social interaction go up, do you use your phone less? Vice versa, do you feel more overwhelmed at school? Do you use your phone and your device more to kind of replace those feelings of anxiety? So that's a project we're doing starting now, and then we're going to follow up with kids next fall and next spring.
That is absolutely fascinating. As in, I don't think many people would know that there are experts in these fields looking at this and analyzing all of this. So I think from all the parents out there, we say thank you. But I know parents will be very, very eager to know, day-to-day basis. Dr. Lauricella, tell us top tips on dealing with technology and our kids. What would they be?
So developmentally, I think we have to be a little bit careful. These tips change with the age of your kids.
Yes.
My tip that goes across the spectrum is that you're the parent, and you can make rules, and that rules are good, even if your kids don't think they're good. We know that middle schoolers and adolescents are going to fight, especially media rules. But we also know that adolescents need some parameters, frankly, to push against. If you have no rules, a part of adolescence is to figure out where they stand, how they can hold their own, how they can fight to be independent. If there are no rules, then in general, then there's not less for them to kind of push back against. So I would encourage parents to have thoughtful media rules, and to create spaces where interpersonal interaction is important, right? And is the focus. And to recognize that even as adults, it's hard to not respond to the pings, to the emails, to the phone beeping. So create context where that is less of a distraction. So maybe having no phones at the dinner table, like kind of set consistent rules that you can encourage your kids to follow. And I would say start those early. In general, with, we don't think about cell phone use with our 5-year-olds because they don't have one yet. But if you create these rules and say, we're not doing cell phones at the table, and you have a 5-year-old, and you as the adults stop bringing your phone to the table, you're modeling the behavior that's expected later on. In the same way, again, we ask kids to eat healthy foods, but these are things parents aren't really thinking about. Like, oh, I don't need to worry about the phone yet. That's for middle school parents to deal with. So that's an important one. And to have conversations with your kids about this. Like, yes, I know that you want your phone. I totally hear you. And I totally hear that you're missing out on things when you don't have your phone. But sorry, these are the rules, but this is what kind of our expectations are. The other kind of piece that I like to kind of ping in parents' minds is how much freedom a phone gives a child. And we don't think about it in that way. We have age rules on when you can vote and when you can get your driver's license, because we know kids aren't capable of managing their own attention span on some levels, right? We don't want kids to be distracted in the car when they're driving. So we say you have to be 16 or 17 to get your license, where you have better mental capacity to like block out the distractions of different things. And yet we hand a cell phone to a child in 5th grade or 6th grade and kind of have it be a free for all. There's no driver's ed for your cell phone. There's no expectation or explanation of how to use it in a safe and healthy way. There's not oftentimes scaffolding that says that where parents can help kids, begin to have the skills to inhibit the messages and to put it away. We don't train them on the language to use when you get 85 texts from a group text to say, I can't answer all this, right? Like, how do we train our kids to have those social responses that are both reasonable in their peer group, but also respectful of the individual child's time. And so I think just beginning to have those conversations way earlier than you think you would with kids, before they get the phone, as they get their phones, etc. And to just be consistent and have routines. I think every kid from 2 until 18 or 85, my mom or somebody else would also be really upset if I just came in and grabbed the phone away from them in the middle of doing something. So have clear rules, like, okay, dinner time, no phone or no media, and be clear. Okay, if you're going to watch a TV show, my 3-year-old knows she gets to watch one show. When the show is over, it's going to be turned off, right? And I'm consistent on that rule and that expectation, so that it's not a debate every single time. Can I watch 2? Can I watch 3? Nope, the rule is 1. And you're going to get your 1, right? I know you're going to get it. And you even have a schedule, right? So after my kindergartner's done with her Zoom classes, she's allowed to watch 1 show. She knows it's going to come. I don't have to have her asking me at 8 o'clock in the morning if she can watch it. She knows it's at that time. And it alleviates a lot of the hassle of sort of standard expectations around the use. So those are big tips. And I would say, additionally, be very careful on the content and watch the content with your kids. Your kids want you to be watching it and engaging with them. Even the high schoolers, they will act like they don't, but they like to talk about it. So sit down and be like, oh my gosh, like, show me what's happening on Instagram. Like, show me the funny TikTok you're making, or ask for them to be the experts and to teach you about it, are great ways to kind of open that door and that conversation around the technology use.
That last point hit home. I was actually just watching that show Monk with my mum yesterday, and it felt nice. It's both English is not her first language, but she can obviously see what Adrian Monk was like in his interesting behaviors. But that time element is so important, I think, with parents, and I think especially now with a lot of more parents are working. And now with working from home, it's not that they bring home work to home. Work is home. So, and to be able to, as you said earlier, is to shift that, have that mind shifts, can be very, very hard. But I think overall, what we have learned from pediatrics and every other study regarding children, time with parents is absolutely essential. And not just, I'm there with my child and playing on my own phone, but actually being present in what they're in their activity. It goes, a little moment like that can go a very, very long way. Larissa, I want to end with, this has been a fascinating conversation, and there's so many things that could probably speak about more. But let me just end it here, but ask you 3 questions. And I'm trying to start a trend of a signature, as a lot of good podcasts do. And that first question is, and just fill in the blank. Health is.
Oh gosh, that's it. Okay. Health is, I would say, moderation.
Health is moderation. Care is.
Oh boy. Care is openness.
Care is openness. And lastly, love is.
Oh, love is love. I mean, love is love. I think love is everything. I don't know. I don't have a good, I was going to say caring is love for the other one too. Yeah, I think love is everything. And I would say kindness is everything on that one too. I think that's one that, back to the schooling stuff too, right? We don't teach kids to express positive emotions, right? We don't teach kids to talk about love and to talk about happiness and we and kindness and stuff like that. And I think the love part is really, really important. I think a good ending for this too is relationships, right? Relationships are critical as a child development person. And the fear that remote learning was going to destroy any hope of kids forming relationships with their teachers. On a very small, anecdotal level, my kindergartner's teacher, one day, one kid just said, maybe it was back in October, teacher, I love you. And then all the kids jumped in, I love you. They've never met her. They've only seen her on Zoom, and they love her and they love her. And she's like, I love you back. It was like this very wonderful space that I think nobody thought could possibly have happened this year. And so I think that's a great one to kind of end on.
Dr. Lauricella, thank you so much for your time and for this great conversation. Hopefully in the future we will, especially when your more research comes out, from especially the great work that you're doing, have probably dive in more into all of that. Thank you again. Thank you to the viewers who've been watching and who've been listening and took something out of this. Thank you again for watching. And I have some great ideas coming up, especially that Ramadan's around the corner. I've got another episode hopefully ready for that. And we will continue to have great conversations with great experts about health and healthcare and health communication. Stay tuned. Thank you very much. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.